In this video, we will be talking about the short story. I'll give you a brief introduction to it, as well as who the author is, how the plot unfolds, what is the historical context, the characters, what themes occur, symbols, literary devices, etc. So I'll get started. You're going to be writing these notes in your books, so you'd have access to them and gives you time to actually meditate on what you're writing. So here we go. To Dado in Memoriam is an autobiographical short story. It was written by Paule Marshall and published in 1967 during the height of the Black Arts Movement. This short story takes on first person narration, and the narrator is an adult looking back at her childhood visit to Barbados in 1937. This intense interaction between grandmother and granddaughter further explores the major themes of the short story, which includes tradition versus modernity, colonialization, generational conflict, race, identity, and the inevitability of change, as well as death. Valenza Pauline Marshall was raised within both Caribbean and American cultures. Her early life shaped her literary focus on diaspora and identity. She was actually born in Brooklyn, New York, to Barbadian immigrant parents. And when she was 9 years old, she traveled to Barbados with her mother and met her grandmother for the first time. This is how the story was inspired. She graduated with a literature degree and later adopted Paul for professional reasons. She published her first book, her first novel, Brown Girl, Brown Stones, and dedicated it to her grandmother. She went on to work as a journalist as well as taught at different American universities. Her writing centered predominantly on the Black female experience, memory, culture, and resistance. So let's discuss the plot of this story. We are going to be discussing the five stages of plot: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, falling action, and the resolution. In the exposition, we meet the characters, the setting, and the conflict. Our characters are the 9-year-old narrator and her grandmother Dado. The narrator arrives with her family in Barbados for the first time from New York, and the conflict, which is established, is we get to see that Dado has a deep pride in the land, whereas the narrator, who is now being exposed to this traditional life, is more of a modern girl. She's from an industrial New York background. So these two worlds are meeting and colliding in the exposition. In the rising action now, things get a little bit more complicated. Dadu is showing off her land, her trees, the cane fields, and insists that there is nothing that New York has that can be compared to Barbados. The narrator takes it up as a challenge, and she continues to show off her knowledge of New York's power and scale, its technology, its machines, the snow, the buildings. And each time there is this consistent competition, an unspoken competition between these two worlds, Barbados and New York, via the two characters, Dado and her granddaughter. In the climax, Dado shows the narrator a towering royal palm and challenges her and says that there's nothing at all taller in New York than this palm tree that she has such great pride in. The narrator decides, hey, you know what? My grandmother's not going to believe me, but I'm going to tell her the truth. The truth is, the Empire State Building is much bigger, and that absolutely shatters Dado's how powerful and upstanding her world is. And that's the climax. So let's continue on to the falling action and the resolution. All right, so just to briefly recap, we have the exposition where both characters meet and both of them have their pride in their world that they're meeting with. Then we have the competition between, let me show you what I have. You don't have anything better than I do. And it's going back and forth until finally the main character decides to tell her grandmother, boom, the Empire State Building is towering above this palm tree that you're showing me. Now, as a result of that, in the falling action, consequences of that decision was that Dadu's spirit was broken. And because her spirit was broken, she starts to withdraw and she starts to detach from her land. She's growing weaker and weaker, and she's spending her days sitting down in her chair and just looking out the window. And she's no longer engaged with her surroundings that she was so proud of. The resolution comes, and again, this is like this is an illustration of which world won. Dadu dies during a labor unrest in 1937 when the British aircrafts were swooping over the land. And for the narrator, she is living on knowing that she carries the weight. She carried the weight of Dadu's death because she felt as if she was the one who killed her grandmother. And this is all symbolic that the old way of life, the, the previous way of life, the traditional way of life, is also dying and it's being taken over and overshadowed by the modern power that is of that day. To better understand the story, let's take a step back into history as well as into time. During the 1930s, Barbados was a British colony, and their economy was based on the sugarcane agriculture. This economy was built from the legacy of slavery and colonial exploitation. During the 1930s, the Great Depression also worsened poverty for many Black Barbadians, and while they were experiencing that poverty, the white minority continued to profit. Hence the dynamics between the people during that time and in that season. So during the 1930s, there were a lot of labor strikes and riots that erupted where the workers were demanding better wages and rights. And as a response, in response to that, Britain sent warships and planes to reassert their imperial control. When you read the story, you're going to see that this historical event is framed around Dado's death in the story. In contrast, we have Dadu representing old Barbados and the narrator representing New York. You see the contrast between the two places because New York is reinforced with references to the Empire State Building, which was built in 1931. And this building in New York represented American industrial and America as an industrial and economic power. Dada is the narrator's 80-year-old grandmother, and she represents several things. She is representative of tradition. She is an ancestral authority. She has very deep connections with the land and with nature. She is very resistant to modernization and machines, even vehicles. She has colonial era beliefs about race and power. Though she is physically frail, she is mentally strong and proud. Her defeat upon learning about the Empire State Building symbolizes a collapse of the old worldview under which they were colonial forces. So she is the antagonist of our narrator. And then we have our narrator. She is 9 years old, very strong willed, and very competitive. She symbolizes modernity and change. She is a cultural hybrid, a mixture of Caribbean and American. Although she wins the intellectual contest between herself and her grandmother, she later experiences tremendous guilt and grief. And while it shows emotional maturity, it literally burdens her later on in life because she believes that she is responsible for the death of her grandmother. I'm going to briefly touch on five major themes in the story To Dado in Memoriam. And let's start off with the first one, and that will be tradition versus modernity. Mm, Dado represents all things nature, all things agricultural, and all things traditional, while our narrator represents technology, urban living, and progress. Their conversation function as a symbolic contest between the past and the future, and we wait to see in the end who wins. The second major theme in this short story is life and death cycles, change and death cycles, life death cycles. The story reflects that change will happen, and it echoes the idea that progress often requires loss. So while that loss was very drastic, we lost Dado in the end of the story. It shows again when life begins, it has to eventually end. And this story showed in the end, she died and I lived. So Dado's death symbolizes a physical death, but it's also a loss of outdated ideologies, the one that she represented. Thirdly, we have colonial power, and this was reflected when the British planes flew over Barbados, and they did so to show their dominance and imperial dominance and violence. Their destruction of the land more or less mirrored the emotional destruction that Dado experienced earlier when her granddaughter told about the Empire State Building. Fourthly, we have race. Dado has a Dada has a colonial mindset, and she associates whiteness with supremacy, whereas the narrator has an American upbringing that allows her a little bit of flexibility regarding to race, and she views white people as equals. This highlights the generational and cultural shifts in racial consciousness in this story, in this family. And while this family, theme number five, love and family relationships, while this family has disagreements, uh, both the narrator and her grandmother have a deep bond, and the story emphasizes that concept of Caribbean family ties, respect for elders, and ancestral legacy, where we would travel and visit family and bring things to our families from abroad, as was done by Audrey, the mother of the narrator. Now, there's a minor one that's here is that the concept of gender and how Dadu prefers boys or males, assertiveness, competitiveness, confidence, and in comparison to girl grandchildren. And the narrator actually kind of fulfill that fierceness, aggression in her personality. So these are the themes. There might be a lot more, but these are the ones I'm focusing on for now. Let's discuss the first set of symbols that we have highlighted here. And the first one is sugarcane. Sugarcane comes from Dado's world, and this is a representation of Caribbean history, Caribbean survival, as well as exploitation because of the sugar cane industry, agriculture. The second one is the Empire State Building. This one comes from the narrator's world, and this is a symbol of modernity as well as to show industrial power and strength. The third one, going back to Dado's world, is Bissex Hill. And this is again tradition, natural authority, because the hill is of nature, as Dadu is of nature, and it's very tall. So in Dadu's world, that's the tallest thing that she has ever seen. So let's take a moment and we're going to go forward into the next three. Here are the last three symbols that we're going to briefly discuss. And the first one are planes. This is not from the narrator's world, but it is part of the legacy then of Barbados. These planes came from the British, and they are representative of colonial violence and destruction. The second one is from the narrator's world, and that's snow. And for her to describe that to her grandmother, it was very foreign. It's associated with and affiliated with death and alienation. Death because, as she explained to her grandmother, all the trees would be bare and dead for the time being. And then there's, of course, alienation because it's the separateness. It separates you from nature completely. Okay? And thirdly, the Burpees chair. That chair, if you notice, was very relevant in the end of the story. We had Dadu in the middle of the story walking, hiking, moving around on her land, up and down the place. Whereas in the end, she accepted the defeat and she sat on that chair for a very long time, most of the days. And that chair represents rest, but it also represents aging and eventually death. These are the six symbols that we're going to be looking at. Now, of course, the language in this creative work is very rich. And Marshall used a lot of imagery in her writing, as you've seen, I quote, seas of sugarcane and huge swirling Van Gogh suns, thunderous tread of machines. So she uses imagery a lot, and there are quite a number of metaphors in her work as well. And open quotation, sugarcane described as clashing like swords. And it shows the danger and the beauty of the sugarcane. And you have the plains, they are metaphorically described as monstrous birds and hardback beetles. And this emphasizes destruction and what is to come, inevitability. As was mentioned before, and just to recap, this is a first person narration. And even though it's a child narrator, it's her reflecting back in her childhood. So her tone throughout this story is very reflective. And it reinforces the concept of loss and memory. If you notice in the very beginning, there is a epitaph at the beginning, and this was from Labert Bethune poem, and the poem is At My Grandmother's Grave. So you start off with that epitaph, and you also have In Memoriam in the title, and you're kind of already prepared for, hey, you'll be talking about death, you'll be talking about remembrance and ancestral legacy. In the end, this story is a work of change, lost cultural inheritance. It literally uses that relationship between grandmother and granddaughter to show that progress can erase tradition and memory, however, can be used to preserve what history threatens to destroy. The narrator survived the transition and lost her grandmother. However, she was permanently influenced from that moment onward, and she carried the legacy of her grandmother in her memory into the modern world and into her future. So that in a nutshell is Tudado in Memoriam by Paule Marshall.